G'day, how we going? What an absolute banger of a year we had for video games in 2023. There were some real stinkers, some just really awful games that really stood out for the wrong reasons, but most importantly were the amount of incredible games that, they weren't just good, they were great. There were so many great games that were of such high quality, and still a lot that I haven't been able to get to because they're either very long and I've spent a lot of time with very long games this year, or there's just too many of them for me to keep up with whilst I'm playing other things. I was preoccupied with Overwatch 2 for a lot of it, and then had some really big games that I was playing like Persona 5 or Boulders Gate 3. So enough rambling, let's get on to the games that I finished in 2023. Golf Story, a cute little RPG focused around, you guessed it, playing golf. You go around completing various tasks for others using your golfing skills and set out to compete in tournaments in order to become a pro. It's mostly easy with a significant difficulty spike for the final tourney, but a lot of fun nonetheless. And the beauty is that I don't have to deal with any ad spam like a certain other golf series. Observation. You play as an AI robot and use cameras as well as drones to navigate a space station and complete various, for lack of a better word, puzzles. I didn't feel like there was a whole lot to these puzzles, and navigation can be quite painful at times. The story feels like a mix of Interstellar and 2001: A Space Odyssey, but is so frustrating to play that I'd recommend just either reading the story on Wikipedia or watching a playthrough. Halo Infinite. This is not a good game in the context of the Halo series, and it's definitely not a good game as its own standalone adventure. The campaign ran poorly, featured a boring open world that is not fun to drive around in, forgettable antagonists. The story introduces a brand new faction with no explanation of any sort. There seems to have been an entire game's worth of story that is never told to us or conveyed in any way. And of the nearly 8 hours I played, I'd say only 2 to 3 hours of that actually featured something of substance. I feel sorry for fans waiting on a title that can match the brilliance of any Bungie Halo title. Halo 4. As this title shows, 343 has been fucking up the series from the start. It looks pretty, especially for the time, but just doesn't hit like the older games did. Iconic weapons had their sound ruined, iconic vehicles like the Warthog sound like shit, the arenas aren't anywhere near as fun to fight in as they were in 3, but the story of Chief and Cortana is actually decent and well acted enough that it's pretty much the only reason to bother playing it. Persona 5 Royal. A big time commitment full of charm, wonderful music, and an engaging turn-based combat system. It does get a little ridiculous with how switched on these supposed teenagers are, and how there's basically no adults that have their shit together. And there's two characters I won't spoil who sort of get a redemption type arc that I don't think is deserving at all. I think 4 has the strongest story and characters, but 5 is definitely a banger that I enjoyed. Hi-Fi Rush. Where were you when the 2023 Game of the Year was shadow dropped? I do wish I could actually say that and mean it. Unfortunately, it wasn't even nominated for the overall Game of the Year, which is a fucking crime because it is my personal Game of the Year. But anyway, from out of nowhere, the devs behind The Evil Within gave us a hack and slash game that is essentially BPM meets Jet Set Radio meets Devil May Cry. I cannot praise this game more. Perfect soundtrack, great characters with wonderful voice acting, a fun combat system, and some incredible visuals that are so well animated. A truly wonderful game to have received at the start of the year. Hogwarts Legacy. Unfortunately, this game is pretty much a 5 or 6 out of 10 experience at best. The recreation of Hogwarts is brilliant, the scale is amazing, it looks great. The combat becomes a lot of fun once you've unlocked more slots, but the rest of the game feels no different to a Ubisoft spamathon. The world itself is empty with almost nothing to do, barely any interesting side stories, no interesting gear or anything to find, an over-reliance on collecting useless collectibles, a poorly written main story, and at the time of release, it was full of terrible performance issues. The strangest thing that came out of this release was watching people praise it as the greatest open world game ever made purely because it was from a certain IP. I wish I could be so blinded by an IP that I ignore blatant issues. Marvel's Midnight Suns. The gameplay is really enjoyable. It's a lot of fun seeing so many different abilities for each character and trying to find a synergy that works best. But it's full of so many issues. Performance is dogshit. Graphics usually look dated at best. There are no expected quality of life features like saving individual decks for different playstyles, and, the cherry on top, the writing is kinda terrible. There are some genuinely great moments between characters, and I was interested in some of the conversations, but then the game decides that every single character has to be a quippy dickhead, and even the plot is full of so many holes. It's a wonder there wasn't further revision done by the writers. One of the weirdest games I've played, because even though it's really enjoyable enough to keep me hooked and wanting to finish it, it's also a really poorly made game. Red Dead Redemption 2. They say third time's a charm, and that couldn't be more true with this game for me. Originally, I put only an hour or two into the story, and then sunk about 20 into the multiplayer. I came back and sunk another 4 into the story and just dropped it again. Finally, I sat down and allowed myself to be fully immersed into the world, story, and side stories. Missions are sometimes insanely restrictive and repetitive, but you still get an insanely detailed world, beautifully written character arcs for so many characters, not just Arthur, engaging systems that are a joy to play with if you allow yourself to become immersed in the game, and some of the best voice acting that's ever graced the medium. Other than mission design, Rockstar absolutely outdid themselves with this title, and the boots they have to fill now are so massive, it must be scary for the team to think about. Heavenly Bodies. You, and hopefully a buddy if you have one available, complete a series of tasks inside your little space station. You control each arm separately and have to grab items and walls in order to move yourself around in 0G. It seems simple, but it becomes a fucking hilarious nightmare as you try to figure out how to move around effectively, and then add the hilarity that comes with playing with someone else, and it becomes such a fun experience. Diablo IV. Unlike Diablo 3, there is an actual story worth listening to here, and the game does an excellent job of engaging you and presenting an interesting premise with great characters, especially Lilith, beautiful visuals, and a terrific soundtrack. Gameplay wise, it's mostly more of the same. A lot of action RPGs really do play almost the same, but it's solid, and some of the bosses have some actual mechanics that made fighting them a lot more interesting. Performance during the fights, with lots of shit flying around the screen, was actually pretty decent, though it wasn't without faults entirely, due to crashes and weird glitches like the horse refusing to sprint. Some areas became inaccessible due to lag or something, but overall I had a really positive experience with this game when it comes to the story. With the end game grind, that's where I just completely fell off because drop rates for me were abysmal. It was way too grindy to try to level up. It really highlighted the importance of following a guide for your build, because there's not much room for you to experiment with different skills and stuff, because it was so expensive to respec your character. So you don't have much freedom when it comes to that. During the campaign, it's okay. I still wish it was free, but it's way cheaper and you don't feel as restricted when it comes to experimenting. But yeah, that endgame grind, awful. The first season that came out ended up being awful. And of course, there's their absolutely terrible monetization and shop. Blizzard are cunts. Killer Frequency. A seemingly basic indie title where you run a late night radio show, which quickly becomes an intriguing mystery as you become the sole 911 operator during a night of murders, or a night of attempted murders. Through the branching dialogue, you're able to help your callers get away from the murderer and slowly piece the story together. Great art style, great 80s inspired tracks to play in between calls, solid voice acting, and genuinely tense moments make this a title worth playing. Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy. My sisters suggested this game as a joke to a group of us and said we should race to see who could finish it first. 6 hours later, I finished my first run, and although I had to deal with very few instances where it seemed like the game was working against me, more so than me making a genuine mistake, I felt like it was a great accomplishment and taught me to endure and keep pushing. I thought I'd shut the game off for good, but ran it another 7 times and even got my time as low as 21 minutes, which I was super happy with. Returned to it a few months later and managed to get the time down to about 13 minutes. Cuphead. I jokingly said I needed something easy to calm me down after playing Getting Over It, and ended up finally sticking with this gem and finished it after having it in my library since release. It is very difficult at times and a lot to deal with because of how much shit can be flying about the screen, but I think it's quite fair in its design. Music is top notch, and visually I would put this in a top 10 list without hesitation. The art style is gorgeous. The DLC is a banger too, with a very fun final boss to close it up. Pathfinder Kingmaker. This was a very mixed experience for me. I decided to give it a go because I had spent a fair amount of time learning D&D 5th edition and figured I'd be able to grasp the Pathfinder rule set more easily than if I jumped into it with zero tabletop experience. I think learning D&D helped me appreciate these sorts of games in a way I hadn't before, but I still struggled a lot. The rules are a lot more complicated and in depth, and most of the time the game just doesn't seem balanced in a fair way at all. I'm not one for min-maxing or reading every single piece of info related to builds and skills and trying to map out the perfect way to build my party. And if you're the same, you're going to be in for a rough time because it's so easy to accidentally build a shit character or spend most of your time dying because you haven't found the necessary gear or companions to make life easier. I saw a comment that described this game perfectly. It said playing this game was like playing a D&D campaign where the DM hates the people playing. Boulders Gate 3. Wow, what an experience this game is. There are certainly some negatives about the game that I think people mostly ignored in their reviews, and some patches actually managed to make certain things worse, but this is still an incredible game. Voice acting, graphics, art style, music, creativity, writing, and the sheer amount of meaningful content all comes together nicely in a beautiful package that, despite its issues, was a treat to play. More thoughts from me can be found in my video for it. Stray Gods, the role-playing musical. A lead voiced by Laura Bailey, and music by Austin Wintory. I didn't need to know much else to want to give this game a try. I loved that the actors themselves are the ones doing the singing, and the game is so campy sometimes that it really emulates the feel of watching a theatre production, which is very fitting. I had some issues with the mixing of the voices being all over the place and sometimes being way too quiet compared to other sounds, but other than that, it was an enjoyable playthrough with many different outcomes, allowing different sounding songs on top of the changing story. Star Wars Jedi Survivor. It's a shame what state the game launched in and what state it was still in months later when I finally played it. Once the game stops dropping frames, stuttering like crazy, and crashing every now and then, it becomes a very enjoyable evolution of Jedi Fallen Order. Combat gets a little frustrating in some group fights and with some bosses where animation locking causes you to take hits, which is extra frustrating on the highest difficulty, but otherwise it looks great, the characters are very well acted, the levels are huge and have a lot of hidden secrets tucked away for you to find once you unlock more traversal items. I just wish Respawn actually gave a shit about the quality of it. Tiny Tina's Wonderland. I only had an okay time with this one. I remember enjoying the first Borderlands game a lot and absolutely loved the second game. We don't talk about 3. But with Wonderlands, although it's a good spin-off that's very familiar for the most part, just has a Dungeons and Dragons beat to it, I felt like it didn't really do anything new. It was still just very familiar to the rest of the Borderlands series. So if you love the gameplay loop of Borderlands and you love grinding for the best weapon drops, you'll have a blast with this one. Alan Wake 2. I didn't think we'd ever get this game, to be honest. All hope seemed to be somewhat lost due to the poor sales of the first game, and even though it took some time, I am so happy that we finally got it. This game is a huge evolution of everything Remedy has been learning with how they implement music, how they tell stories, and even how they integrate live action scenes. Everything just comes together into this wonderful, unique package that no game has come close to doing before. Some of the gameplay is immediately familiar if you've played other survival horror games, but the story will constantly keep you guessing, and the visuals will for sure have you stopping to appreciate the details and take in the views. Aliens Fireteam Elite. I've owned this game for a little while now, and I regret not booting it up when I first bought it to give it a proper go, because I should have just refunded it. It's an okay game, it's just a real bummer that the levels of excitement you get from playing never get any higher than the first 2 levels. I pushed on with my mate thinking it'd get better, but it stayed average at best all the way through to the end, and neither one of us were interested in buying the DLC, which would just be more of the same. A lot of the, let's just call them special infected, because it's pretty much a Left 4 Dead type game. The special infected are not very unique. Most of them act exactly the same. It's not overly challenging at all outside of a couple of encounters that we had to retry. And the story is, to me, it's pretty much non-existent. Here's to hoping Dark Descent will keep me engaged though, because I do love the Alien series. Warhammer Vermintide 2. Easily one of the better Left 4 Dead type games. The focus is on melee combat instead of guns primarily, and there are multiple characters with differing skills and builds to be made into. If I had a party of friends that was interested in playing more of this, I'd be on it in a heartbeat. But unfortunately, my mate only wanted to knock over the main missions. Very fun, still looks really nice, and ran without a hitch for us. Sifu. Brilliant game, but can easily kick your ass at first until you get your timing down and learn which enemies low kick, because they tended to be the ones that threw me off the most during my playthrough. Bosses kind of follow different rules than regular enemies when it comes to staggering, hyper armor, etc. But it's about the only complaint I really have for the game, and it's a minor one at best. I can see why someone would restart runs over and over until they get the perfect no death run, due to how easy it is to get into the game and how much there is to master. Mario plus Rabbids Battle Kingdom. I had a pretty average time with this one. I enjoy seeing familiar franchises be hit with different gameplay than we used to, and I think the turn-based XCOM style is a great one to try and emulate, but it wears thin in this game. I finished it in about 20 hours, and if it was half the length, I think it wouldn't be so bad due to team composition not really feeling like it changes all that much, and fights are largely the same, both in terms of enemies and the layout of the actual battleground. Except for the ghosts in World 3, they are a pain in the ass. Overall though, I was at least interested enough in the game that I am looking forward to playing the second game, Sparks of Hope, because from what I've read about it, it's actually done a lot to improve the gameplay. That's 2023 done and dusted. I would say Space Marine 2 is probably my most anticipated game for next year, and I am genuinely curious what's going to happen with Skull and Bones. I cannot believe it's finally going to release, so I will definitely be waiting to see how much of a dumpster fire that ends up being. Until the next video, have a good one.